The news that CEO Victoria Hale had just finalized her divorce swept through the company in a single morning. By the afternoon, the boardroom felt so cold that no one dared to look her in the eye. Before, she controlled everything. Now, they were all just waiting for her to make a mistake. When the meeting ended, Ethan Cole packed his documents, intending to leave quickly. "Stay," her voice rang out behind him. The heavy doors clicked shut. Ethan turned. Victoria stepped closer, her gaze no longer controlled. "They think I'm about to lose everything, so I need a husband. Be mine." Ethan Cole was 34 years old, and he liked his life exactly the way it was. Quiet, predictable, and entirely invisible. As the lead systems engineer for Hale Enterprises, he was the man who kept the digital gears turning while staying far away from the corporate spotlight. He was a man defined by two things: his technical brilliance and his 9-year-old daughter, Mia. Since his own divorce 2 years ago, Ethan's world had shrunk to a manageable, safe size. His mornings were spent making blueberry pancakes and checking Mia's math homework, and his evenings were dedicated to complex Lego sets and stories about space. He was a single dad first, an engineer second, and a social creature not at all. He purposefully avoided office politics, power struggles, and the vicious gossip that fueled the water cooler conversations. He was the safe choice, the reliable hand, the man who never caused drama. Victoria Hale, on the other hand, was the drama, even if she spent every waking hour trying to suppress it. At 30, she was one of the youngest and most formidable CEOs in the tech industry. She was sharp, elegant, and possessed a mind that worked like a high-frequency trading algorithm. But her world had just suffered a massive tectonic shift. Her divorce from Julian Vane, a high-profile billionaire investor with deep, poisonous ties to the company's board, had turned her private life into a public liability. The board of directors was already circling like vultures over a fresh kill. In the ruthless world of high finance, a divorce wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was seen as a crack in the armor. Julian was using his immense influence to whisper in the eyes of the shareholders, suggesting that Victoria was unstable, emotional, and distracted. There was a massive merger on the horizon, the Phoenix acquisition, and if Victoria couldn't project an image of absolute stability and traditional strength, the board would use a morality clause to strip her of her position. Ethan stood in the silent boardroom, the scent of Victoria's expensive floral perfume clashing with the sterile smell of the polished leather chairs. He looked at her, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He was a man of logic, and this proposal defied every logical parameter he had ever encountered in his career. "Victoria, I think you've reached the wrong floor," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "I'm a systems guy. I fix servers and patch security holes. I don't do whatever this is. I don't even own a tuxedo that fits." Victoria didn't move. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting in her dark, unblinking eyes like stars in a void. "I've spent 3 full days analyzing every single employee file in this building, Ethan. I didn't choose you because of your romantic potential or your fashion sense. I chose you because you are a ghost. You have no scandals. You have no political ties to Julian or the board. You have a daughter you adore, which makes you relatable and trustworthy to the public. And most importantly, you have no reason to betray me because you don't care about the throne." She turned to face him, her professional mask cracking just enough to show the raw desperation underneath. "Julian is going to try to prove I'm unfit to lead during the Phoenix Gala next month. He wants to paint me as a lonely, crumbling woman. If I show up alone, I'm the tragic divorcee. If I show up with a new, stable, devoted husband who has been by my side in secret, I'm a woman who has moved on and found balance. It buys me the 3 months I need to close the merger and secure the company's future." Ethan shook his head, thinking of Mia's innocent face at the breakfast table. "This is insane. My daughter. I can't bring her into a fake marriage. I can't lie to her, and I won't expose her to the paparazzi. She's already been through enough with her mother leaving." "I'm not asking you to lie to her yet," Victoria said softly, stepping closer until Ethan could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. "I'm asking you to save the jobs of 5,000 people. If Julian succeeds in the hostile takeover after I'm ousted, the first thing he'll do is liquidate the engineering department to pad the margins. Your team, your friends, they'll be gone by Christmas, including you." Ethan froze. He knew she was right. Julian Vane was known for strip and flip acquisitions. He didn't care about innovation or the people behind the code. He cared about the bottom line. Ethan looked at his calloused hands. He thought about the men and women he worked with every day, people with mortgages and kids of their own. He thought about the stability Mia needed, the stability that required him to have a steady, high-paying job. "What are the actual terms?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Victoria took a final step forward, the sharp light of a dealmaker returning to her eyes. "A legal contract, 6 months of performance, a quiet, private ceremony with no press, a shared residence for public appearances, but we will have entirely separate wings. No physical contact beyond what is necessary for the cameras. And at the end, a quiet annulment and a trust fund for Mia that ensures she never has to worry about her education." Ethan looked at the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a digital cliff. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a liar. He was just a dad who wanted to protect his daughter's world. But he realized that sometimes to protect the world, you have to play a role you never auditioned for. He took a deep breath. "Fine," Ethan said. "But if this touches Mia in a negative way, I'm out. Contract or no contract." Victoria nodded, a single tear escaping her controlled facade. "Agreed. Welcome to the family, Ethan. Ethan, would you refuse the deal or listen further?" The agreement was signed on a rainy Tuesday in a lawyer's office that didn't officially exist on any public floor. Ethan felt like he was signing away his soul, but Victoria looked like she was finally breathing for the first time in weeks. The plan was executed with military precision. First, a leaked photo of them having a casual coffee in a park. Then, a quiet internal announcement of a long-time friendship that had blossomed into something more. Within 48 hours, Ethan Cole went from being the guy who fixed the Wi-Fi to the most talked-about man in the company. The gossip spread through the offices like a digital virus. In the cafeteria, the whispers followed him like a physical weight. "Look at him. He was just a tech lead. Now he's sleeping his way to a VP spot. I bet he planned this the moment he heard she was single." Victoria must be really desperate to settle for a man who spends his weekends at Lego conventions. Ethan tried to keep his head down, but the entire environment had changed. His own team, people he had mentored for 5 years, looked at him differently now. There was a wall of cold, formal politeness that hadn't been there before. When he walked into the server room, the laughter and the casual shop talk died instantly. He was no longer one of the guys. He was the CEO's trophy husband. The humiliation wasn't just social, it was professional. During a high-level strategy meeting with the regional managers, a man named Marcus, the head of sales who had been vying for Victoria's attention for years, deliberately tried to humiliate Ethan in front of the board. "So Ethan," Marcus sneered, leaning back in his expensive chair, "now that you're closer to the source of power, perhaps you can explain the 5% dip in server uptime in the European sector? Or were you too busy practicing your wedding vows to check the logs?" The room went deathly silent. Victoria's grip on her fountain pen tightened until her knuckles turned white, but she remained silent, watching to see how Ethan would handle the pressure. Ethan felt the heat rising in his neck. He knew Marcus wanted him to explode, to prove he didn't belong in the room. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply opened his laptop and flicked a screen share to the main monitor. "Actually, Marcus, the 5% dip was a scheduled maintenance window to implement the new 256-bit encryption that your sales team promised the clients last month. If you'd read the technical brief I sent on Friday morning, you'd know that. Or were you too busy looking at my wedding ring to do your actual homework?" A few people in the room stifled a laugh. Victoria's lips twitched into the smallest, rarest of smiles. Ethan had won the battle, but he was losing the war of public opinion. He could feel the resentment growing like a shadow behind him. The hardest part, however, was Mia. One evening, while Ethan was packing a small suitcase to move into Victoria's estate for the transition period required by the contract, Mia sat on his bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. "Daddy, why are we moving to the big house?" she asked, her eyes wide and confused. "Is that lady going to be my new mommy? Does she like Legos?" Ethan felt a sharp, twisting pain in his chest. He knelt down on the floor, taking her small, warm hands in his. "No, honey, no one can ever replace your mommy. Ms. Victoria she's a friend who needs our help right now. We're going to live with her for a little while to help her with her work projects. It's like a long camping trip in a very fancy tent, okay?" "But the kids at school said you're married now," Mia whispered. "They said you're famous and that you're going to forget about me." Ethan realized then the true hidden cost of the contract. He had tried to protect Mia's world, but he had inadvertently invited the judgment of the entire world into her life. He saw the confusion and the fear in her eyes, and for a moment he considered calling Victoria and calling the whole thing off, regardless of the consequences. But then he looked at the Hale Enterprises logo on his work laptop. He thought about the 5,000 families. He was stuck between two fires. Victoria wasn't immune to the pressure either. One night in the vast, silent kitchen of her mansion, Ethan found her staring at a bottle of wine, her phone vibrating incessantly with aggressive messages from the board members. "They're demanding a private dinner with the lead investors tomorrow night," she said, her voice sounding hollow and metallic in the large room. "They want to vet you, Ethan. They want to see if you're a liability or an asset. Julian will be there as a consultant. He's going to try to break you in front of them." Ethan walked over and took the wine glass from her hand, replacing it with a glass of cold water. "Let him try. I've dealt with crashed databases, massive security breaches, and catastrophic system failures for 15 years. A billionaire with a hurt ego is just another bug in the system. I'll patch him out." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the cold lens of a legal contract. She saw the quiet strength in his eyes, the absolute lack of fear. She realized that while she had hired a husband, she had accidentally found something much more dangerous to her cold heart: a partner. Do you think Ethan is helping himself or walking into a trap? The Phoenix Gala was held at the top of the Sapphire Tower, a glass and steel monument to corporate ego and unimaginable wealth. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, rare perfumes, and the sound of a string quartet that sounded more like a funeral march than a celebration. Victoria looked stunning in a gown of deep, shimmering emerald, her arm linked tightly with Ethan's. Ethan felt like an actor on a stage he hadn't rehearsed for, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than his first 3 cars combined. Every eye in the room followed their every movement. The whispers were a constant background noise, a rhythmic hissing of judgment, jealousy, and curiosity. "Just keep smiling," Victoria whispered through gritted teeth as they walked the red carpet. "Don't look at the cameras. Look at me like I'm the only thing in the room." The investors were a gauntlet of old men with sharp, cynical eyes. They asked Ethan questions about his background, his education, and his vision for the company. Ethan answered with a calm, technical precision that seemed to catch them off guard. He didn't try to sound like a billionaire. He sounded like a man who knew exactly how the world worked at a foundational level. Then the room went cold. The heavy doors opened and Julian Vane walked in. He was a man who exuded a calculated, polished cruelty. He walked straight toward them, a drink in his hand and a smirk on his face that made Ethan's skin crawl with an instinctive warning. "Victoria, darling," Julian said, his voice loud enough to draw a crowd of curious onlookers. "You look radiant. And this must be the famous Ethan Cole, the man who managed to do in 3 weeks what I couldn't do in 7 years, make you look like a human being." The circle of onlookers tightened. This was the moment the board had been waiting for, the confrontation that would prove Victoria was compromised. "Julian," Victoria said, her voice like a sharpened blade of ice, "this is a business gala, not a divorce hearing. Please move along before you embarrass yourself further." "Oh, I'm just being friendly," Julian sneered, turning his predatory gaze to Ethan. "Tell me, Ethan, does she treat you like a husband or just another line of code in her grand design? Does she give you a performance review after dinner? Or are you just the latest security patch to her public image?" Ethan felt the anger bubbling up, But he remembered his training. He remembered the code. He looked Julian in the eye, his expression completely unreadable. "Mr. Vane," Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying to the very back of the hall. "I'm an engineer. In my world, we don't care about the history of a system. We care about its current performance. And from where I'm standing, Victoria is running more efficiently than she ever did with a legacy component dragging her down. Sometimes you have to delete the old files to make room for progress." A collective gasp went through the room. Victoria's eyes widened in shock. Julian's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, dangerous rage that promised retribution. "You little tech rat," Julian started, but he was interrupted by a frantic assistant whispering in his ear. At that exact moment, the massive OLED screens behind the stage, the ones meant to show the Grand Phoenix acquisition presentation, began to flicker and distort. Instead of the merger logo, a series of private, highly sensitive emails between Victoria and her legal team began to scroll across the screen. The board had been hacked. Someone was airing Victoria's private legal strategies to the entire room of investors. The gala turned into a scene of absolute chaos. The investors began to shout. Victoria turned pale, her hand going to her throat as she watched her career disintegrate in real time. This was the end. The merger was dead, and her legacy was over. "It's a localized breach," someone shouted. "The system is locked from the outside." Ethan didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask for permission. He let go of Victoria's hand and sprinted toward the tech booth at the back of the hall. He shoved the panicked, sweating technician aside and dove into the terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that defied human movement. He wasn't an actor now. He wasn't a fake husband. He was the lead systems engineer of Hale Enterprises, and he was in his element. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Victoria cried, running toward the booth as security tried to hold her back. "It's a physical Trojan horse," Ethan shouted over the roar of the crowd. "Someone planted a hardware override in the server room downstairs. They're projecting this from inside our own secure network." He saw the malicious code, a nasty, recursive loop designed to humiliate Victoria and trigger the morality clause. He recognized the digital signature buried in the packet headers. It was a signature he had seen in Julian Vane's private equity firm's white papers years ago. Julian hadn't just come to talk, he had come to destroy. Ethan bypassed the security firewalls, his mind working in 4 dimensions. He didn't just stop the projection, he reversed the feed. He traced the signal back to its source, a tablet currently held by Julian's lead assistant in the front row. The screens suddenly went black. Then a single image appeared, a high-resolution photo of Julian Vane meeting with a rival CEO 3 nights ago, discussing the secret liquidation and dismantling of Hale Enterprises. The room went into a different kind of silence, a deadly, heavy silence. Ethan stepped out of the booth, his tuxedo rumpled and his face covered in sweat. He walked back to Victoria, who was staring at the screen in disbelief. "The system is stable," Ethan said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. Victoria looked at Julian, who was backed into a corner, his face a mask of terror. As the lead investors turned their fury on him, he had been caught red-handed in a corporate espionage plot. Then she looked at Ethan. She realized that the ghost she had hired had just become the most visible and powerful man in the room. "My husband handled it," Victoria said, her voice clear and ringing with a pride that wasn't faked. But as the cheers began to erupt, Ethan saw a group of men in dark suits, the company's internal security, approaching them with grim expressions. They weren't looking at Julian. They were looking at him. "Mr. Cole," the lead officer said, stepping between him and Victoria, "the board of directors has raised concerns that this hack was far too convenient. They believe you staged the entire event to make yourself look like a hero and secure your position. You're under immediate investigation for corporate sabotage." Ethan froze. He looked at Victoria, then at the cameras. He had saved the merger, but he had just walked into the ultimate trap. The board didn't want the truth. They wanted an excuse to get rid of them both. "Do you trust Ethan or the board?" The following 48 hours were a grueling blur of legal threats, cold interrogation rooms, and flashing cameras. The board of directors, desperate to regain control of the narrative, used the hack as a weapon. They claimed that Ethan, a disgruntled engineer, had manufactured the crisis to cement his status as the CEO's savior. They pressured Victoria to distance herself from him immediately, claiming that the scandal of a fraudulent hero was worse for the stock price than a messy divorce. Ethan sat in his small, original apartment, the silence feeling heavier than it ever had before. He had already packed his bags. He couldn't stay in the mansion. The board was threatening to launch a full criminal investigation that would involve Maya being interviewed by child services to check the validity of the home environment. He couldn't let his daughter pay the price for his choice. He wrote a short, formal resignation letter. He wrote a note to Victoria, releasing her from every clause of the contract. No trust fund for Mia, no annulment fees. He just wanted his quiet life back before it was completely destroyed. As he was reaching for the doorknob to leave, the door opened from the outside. Victoria stood there. She wasn't wearing a designer gown or a sharp blazer. She was wearing an old trench coat and jeans, her hair messy from the wind. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, and she looked smaller than he had ever seen her. "Where are you going, Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm protecting Mia," Ethan said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The board. They'll destroy me to get to you. If I'm gone, the investigation has no target. You keep the merger. You keep your throne. You win, Victoria." Victoria stepped into the cramped apartment, the small space feeling suddenly crowded by her presence. "Is that what you think I want? To win by losing the only person who actually stood up for me when the world was watching?" "Victoria, we had a contract," Ethan reminded her, gesturing to the paperwork on the table. "It was a business transaction. It's over." "The contract is dead, Ethan," she shouted, tears finally spilling over. "I don't want a contract, husband. I don't want a public image or a merger built on a lie. I want the man who spent 3 hours in a freezing server room because he couldn't stand to see me fail. I want the man who puts his daughter's happiness before his own safety every single day." She walked up to him, taking the resignation letter from his hand and tearing it into a dozen pieces. "Tomorrow morning there is an emergency board meeting. I'm going in there to tell them the truth. Not just about Julian's sabotage, but about us. I'm telling them the marriage started as a strategic lie, but that the man standing next to me is the only person in this company with enough integrity to lead us into the future." "They'll fire you on the spot," Ethan warned, his heart hammering in his chest. "Let them," Victoria said, a fierce, unbreakable light returning to her eyes. "I've built one empire from the ground up. I can build another one by lunch, but I won't do it without you by my side. Not as an engineer and not as a contract. As a partner." The next morning, the boardroom felt like a fortress of judgment. The investors were there, their faces grim and expectant. Victoria and Ethan walked in together, hand in hand. It wasn't for the cameras this time. There were no photographers. Victoria presented the cold forensic evidence Ethan had pulled during the hack, evidence that clearly linked Julian Vane's own private server to the breach. She then stood up and looked the chairman of the board directly in the eye. "I hired Ethan Cole to be my husband because I was afraid of you," she said, her voice echoing with a power that shook the room. "I thought I needed a lie to protect my position from your judgment, but Ethan showed me that the truth is a much stronger foundation than any merger. We are not legally married, but he is my partner. And if you want to fire him for saving this company, you'll have to fire me, the lead investors, and the entire Phoenix merger with us." The silence lasted for a lifetime. Finally, the lead investor, an old man who had watched the entire drama unfold with a hidden smile, stood up and began to clap. "Finally, he whispered, "some actual leadership. Would you have stood up for Victoria like Ethan did?" The crisis faded into the history books, but the change it brought was permanent. Julian Vane was barred from the industry, his reputation in tatters. The board of directors, humbled by the massive public support for Victoria and Ethan, backed down and offered Ethan a seat on the executive committee. Life at Hale Enterprises returned to a new kind of normal. Ethan was no longer the CEO's pet. He was the man who had saved the company's soul. He went back to his server room, but now, when he walked in, his team didn't go silent. They stood up, they shook his hand, and they asked him for his advice on the next generation of security. Victoria remained the CEO, but she was a different leader now. She was softer, more transparent, and infinitely more respected. She stopped trying to be a cold algorithm and started being a human being. One warm Saturday afternoon, Ethan was in his backyard, helping Mia build a massive treehouse. The sun was golden, and the air was filled with the sound of birds and the smell of fresh cedar. It was a world away from the Sapphire Tower. A car pulled up into the gravel driveway. Victoria stepped out, carrying a large box of pizza and a set of blueprints she had drawn herself. "Is the structural integrity of this treehouse up to code?" she asked, a playful, happy glint in her eyes. Mia ran to her, hugging her legs tightly. "Miss Victoria, come see! Daddy made a secret door for my Legos!" Ethan climbed down from the wooden ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and he didn't see a CEO or a contract partner. He saw a woman who had walked through the fire with him and come out stronger on the other side. "The contract officially ended yesterday," Ethan said softly, standing close to her. "I know," Victoria replied, her voice gentle. "I was wondering if we could talk about a new one. No lawyers this time. No board members. No trust funds. Just dinner as ourselves?" Ethan looked at Mia, who was already showing Victoria the secret door. He realized that the bug in his life, the loneliness and the fear, had finally been patched. "Dinner sounds like a very stable plan," Ethan said. Victoria laughed, and for the first time, the sound was louder and more beautiful than any boardroom whisper. They had started as a lie, but in the heat of the storm, they had discovered the only truth that actually mattered. They were no longer ghosts in the system. They were finally, truly home. Not everything that starts as a lie is destined to end as one. Sometimes the most difficult circumstances are exactly what we need to strip away our masks and show the world who we truly are. Ethan and Victoria discovered that while power can buy a husband, only integrity can earn a partner. In a world of cold corporate algorithms, never underestimate the power of a human heart to rewrite the code. Subscribe to Hidden Heart Stories if you believe that real relationships can start in the most unexpected ways. Thank you for watching, and remember, always trust the truth,